I now call the member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Like my fellow colleagues, the member for Mitchell and the member for Forrest, I rise today to support this bill, the Australian Citizenship Amendment Defence Families Bill 2012, which will fast-track Australian citizenship for family members of Australian Defence Force personnel who have transferred from military of another country. I do this because, like the Coalition, I believe strongly in supporting our ADF personnel, their families, spouses and dependents. This bill will ensure that partners and dependents of Australian Defence Force transfer members will be eligible for Australian citizenship at the same time as the serving member. An ADF lateral transfer member is a member of the Defence Force who has served in another nation's military and has subsequently moved to Australia to serve in our Defence Force. They come from different countries around the world, including New Zealand, South Africa, the UK and the US. The ADF has a proud history of recruiting members from the armed forces of other countries. These members help to fill critical gaps in our defence workforce and bring skills and experiences to help improve the ADF's understanding of critical issues. I'm sure most would agree, Mr Deputy Speaker, but if the skills of these transfer members add to the capability of our Defence Force, then we should do everything we can to support these serving members and their families. As a child of an Australian soldier, I can understand the importance of this bill for our Defence Force personnel and their families. My mum worried enough about my dad when he was serving overseas. I can't imagine the added stress for our family if Dad was considered an Australian citizen and we were not. What would happen to my mum and her children if Dad was killed overseas in the line of duty? I'd hate to think of the emotional and financial hardships that would follow. Mr Deputy Speaker, we all know that the spouse of an ADF member and their dependents give so much to our nation. Without the full support of their families, many of our frontline soldiers would not continue their service in the ADF. Not only do the families of our soldiers offer a great amount of support to their serving family member, but they are the ones that experiences all the hardships associated with being a defence family. I know all too well about the regular rotations and deployments, which are just one of the part of the many stresses placed on ADF families. During my childhood, my dad was stationed at North Head, Sydney, Wacol in Queensland, Malaya and Holsworthy. I was 3 years old when we moved to Malaya after Dad was deployed there in 1961. He served at Tarandak Camp Malacca from 1961 to 1963. My younger sister Kerry was born in Kuala Lumpur. Things couldn't have been easy for my mum bringing up two small children in a foreign country without the support of her family and friends. In 1963, Dad was transferred to Holsworthy Army Barracks, where he stayed until the end of his career. With each move we had to start over and build a new life, but I consider us to be the lucky ones. Some members of the Defence Force move around on a regular basis, and this can be a great strain on their families. I've also experienced the hardship that families go through when a serving member returns from war with post-traumatic stress syndrome. I was a young child when my dad returned from Vietnam. He fought in the Battle of Long Tan. I remember going into his bedroom to wake him up one morning and he'd jump up and nearly strangle me. He was still in battle mode in the war zone. He slept with his eyes open and relived the horrors of Vietnam in his sleep. To this day, my dad still relives those terrible memories in his dreams. So I know all too well that it's not easy to be a family member of an ADF personnel. But it's the love and support of these family members that helps our soldiers through the tough times. I love my dad and I'd support him through anything. I know that without the love and support he received from my mum and his children, he couldn't have served his country so courageously for all those years. This is why, Mr Deputy Speaker, if we want to keep these soldiers in our Defence Force, we must look after their families too. I'm sure this bill will be a great comfort to many families of those serving our country who are currently living in Australia. We say many families would benefit from the changes, Mr Deputy Speaker. Research carried out by the Defence Families of Australia shows that 90% of ADF lateral transfer members have families they bring with them to live in our country. I can't stress enough how important it is that we support these families and give them the same citizenship status as a serving member. As it stands now, all lateral transfer members are required by law to qualify for permanent residency visas before they can take up a position with the ADF and move to Australia. This is necessary because all ADF members are required to be Australian citizens and permanent residency is a prerequisite to citizenship. Under the Australian Citizenship Act of 2007, a permanent resident may be granted citizenship after completing 90 days permanent service in the ADF or 180 days service in the reserves. The provision of early citizenship under the Act does not include the spouse or the partner of the ADF member, and it does not include their children aged 16 or over because they cannot be included on the ADF member's citizenship application. And while the partners and the dependents of these ADF members are given permanent residency when they move to Australia, they are not offered citizenship. This situation is simply not fair on these families, especially not in a country which values a family unit so much and understands its importance. Australia currently has an ADF lateral transfer of members deployed on operations. If one of these members is killed, there is no legislation or guarantee that would allow their families to stay in Australia or have access to the benefits normally received by the spouse and dependents of an Australian ADF member. I think we need to ask this one simple question, Mr Deputy Speaker. Why should these brave men and women join the Australian Defence Force and support our troops serving overseas if their families aren't going to be looked after in the case of a tragedy? Yes, in the past the government has made assurances that support would be provided for these families, but there is no reason why these assurances can't be turned into legislation. The children of these soldiers also deserve government support for the things like their education. Under the current system, these young people aren't eligible for university help-based placement, which puts significant financial strain on families. I believe that if a family moves to Australia so one of its members can serve in our Defence Force, then that family should be looked after and treated like any other family of an Australian soldier. It's also important to note that the net benefit that Australia gains from recruiting lateral transfer member exceeds any potential costs associated with bringing forward the citizenship status of the member's family. Mr Deputy Speaker, the ADF is looking to recruit up to approximately 300 lateral transfer personnel each year. But I can tell you now, this won't be an easy thing to do if we're not offering a fair citizenship process to the families of these personnel. This legislation will provide families of our Defence Force members with peace of mind. It is a policy that is supported by the Defence Families of Australia, who have been fantastic advocates of our serving men and women. It is a shame, Mr Deputy Speaker, that party politics must be brought into such an important issue, but I do question the motive of the government to rush the bill before Parliament, especially when it's so similar to the Coalition's bill that we introduced on May the 21st. I'd hate to think that our Defence Force personnel have been used by this government to play political games. The Labor government has done nothing in the past 4 years in regard to this issue. In fact, their own Minister for Immigration is on record saying that he did not consider it necessary to amend the citizenship legislation for family members of our lateral transfer personnel. Yet one day after the Coalition introduces its bill, the government introduces a bill that's almost a carbon copy with some additional changes. These changes extend the legislation to include family members beyond partners and dependent children to any dependent, including elderly parents or disabled dependents who are not considered children. It also reduces the relevant defence service criteria for reserve service from 180 days to 90 days, and in the event of a member dies before attaining a citizenship, their spouse and dependents remain eligible for fast-track citizenship. While the Coalition supports these changes, in addition to its own bill, the government could easily introduce them as amendments to a Coalition's bill rather than playing political games and introducing its own bill. But while I do question the motives of the government, this will not stop me from supporting such an important bill for our transfer of defence personnel and their families. I believe that anyone who is prepared to sacrifice their life for this country is worth all the support we can give them, as do their families, whom without the courageous men and women in our armed forces would not be able to do the fantastic job they do for this country. It is this reason that I commend this bill to the House, and I commend the member for Fadden for initiating and bringing this legislation before the Parliament today. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.